Hare Krishna, dear devotees, please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. Thank you for joining us today for the Books Are the Basis Speak Festival. In this video, we have the opportunity to hear from His Holiness Krishna Kshetra Maharaj and His Grace Madhavananda Prabhu on Sri Caitanya Caritamrita. I hope that this podcast will inspire you more to read Srila Prabhupada's books every day. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and access hundreds of such inspirational videos. And if you know a friend who's keen on this topic of reading Srila Prabhupada's books regularly, invite them too. So now on to the video. All glories to Sri Caitanya Caritamrita.
Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Vihari.
Hare Krishna, Madhavananda Prabhu, nice to see you here online for this discussion on Sri Caitanya Caritamrita. I know that you are very expert in and deeply learned in Caitanya Caritamrita, so I look forward to learning things from you today.
Krishna. My pranams, Maharaj. You're very kind, encouraging. I'm just looking forward to having some discussion with you if we can.
Perhaps we should begin with Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami's invocation, his very first verse of Caitanya Caritamrita, Vande Gurun Isha Bhaktan Isham Ishavatarakan Tat Prakash Tat Shakti Krishna Chaitanya Sangyakam. I've always been struck by this pranam mantra as such a comprehensive kind of pranama, and comprehensive, indicating actually how comprehensive the Sri Caitanya Caritamrita is. And I'm also recalling, because we want to discuss, I think, why Caitanya Caritamrita is important for us, followers of Srila Prabhupada, followers of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I must confess, appreciating the comment, the observation of one scholar who studied and has written extensively on Caitanya Caritamrita. We may say as an outsider, but at least one point I think he makes is very relevant, namely that Caitanya Caritamrita is the last word on Chaitanya Leela and on Tattva, on the philosophy and theology of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So he gave that title to his book on Caitanya Caritamrita, The Last Word. It's the last word in more senses than one, we may say, but in any case, it's indicating that Krishnadas Kaviraj is really giving us something so comprehensive that it impels us, I think, to study the work again and again, to celebrate the vision that he is giving us of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his associates, the life and times, and of course the philosophy, which was expounded by his followers, especially the 6 Goswamis. Maybe you want to say something about how it is that Krishnadas Kaviraj came to write the Caitanya Caritamrita?
I once asked our Fakir Mohan Prabhu, a very learned scholar in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, how to understand the apparent differences between our important biographies like Chaitanya Bhagavat or Vrindavan Das Thakur in Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami's Caitanya Charitamrita and Caitanya Mangalochandas Thakur and other literatures, biographies of Mahaprabhu, how sometimes there's seemingly important historical differences. For example, Vrindavan Das Thakur says that Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, who is a very principal associate of Mahaprabhu, that he was a Vaishnav before he met Mahaprabhu. Whereas Kaviraj Goswami in Caitanya Charitamrita says that he was a Mayavadi before he met Mahaprabhu. So Bhakti Mahaprabhu gave such a nice answer. I really appreciate it. He said the way they wrote these literatures was not through empirical historical research. Rather, they were writing according to their Leela Spurti. And in our tradition, we consider Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami to be a Kasturi Manjari in Krishna Leela. And some Vaishnavas consider Vrindavan Das Thakur to be the incarnation of Vyasadeva. And their conception, their mood is quite different. Otherwise, both books are very important. Chaitanya Mangalochan Das Thakur is very important. The Narahari Sarkar's writings, some say that he was the first biographer of Mahaprabhu, Narahari Sarkar, in the form of his Padyavali Kirtans, that he was writing about Mahaprabhu's life. But Kaviraj Goswami gave a very special mood, a very special stress, which is so important in our line of this concept of Manjari Bhav.
Can you say something about how it came about that Krishnadas Kaviraj wrote the Chaitanya Charitamrita? After all, he was very old. His age, it said, as I've heard, that he was over 90 years old, perhaps 95 years old, when he was writing. How did this happen?
Well, there's a famous story that the Vaishnavas requested him to write because he'd been hearing from Raghunath Das Goswami, and that he received a Agyamala, or the order from Govinda Ji, the deity of Rupa Goswami, that he should write this thing. And we see in his literature, as you're mentioning, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami seemed very concerned that he might not live so long. He's writing in some of the early verses in Chaitanya Charitamrita that I'm now very old. I don't know if I'm going to be able to complete this task. And therefore, also he gave synopsises of the entire Chaitanya Charitamrita early on, just in case he wouldn't make it through.
Yes.
Well, I think one of the reasons why Kaviraj Goswami is so special too, he's Kaviraj Goswami. He's the Raja of the Kavis, of poets. And one thing that really strikes me about the Chaitanya Charitamrita in particular, in comparison to other biographies like Lochandas Thakur's Chaitanya Mangal or Vrindavan Das Thakur's Chaitanya Bhagavat, is a poetic expression of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami and the structure that he gives to everything. You're mentioning the first verse of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. In the first, 8 or 10 verses in his Mangalacharna, he packs the entire Chaitanya Charitamrita up in those verses. And each and every chapter, he begins with a Mangalacharna, which is also kind of a compressed sutra of that particular chapter. He gives usually a Sanskrit shloka expressing the entire chapter. And indeed, in the beginning of his Chaitanya Charitamrita, he begins describing about different types of Mangalacharna, the Vasunirdesh, Ashirbad, Namaskar, how a Mangalacharna should have one or more of these three aspects. It should, Vasunirdesh, give some definition of what the subject matter is about, and Ashirbad, the benediction, or Namaskar, there should be some obeisances given. And Kaviraj Goswami, in just a brilliant, brilliant way, he keeps that theme throughout Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's a Bhava Grantha, of course, in the sense that it's a book about feelings, but it's also very systematically presented in terms of literature, in terms of the structure and the writing things he's given. He's an amazing, amazing poet.
Indeed. Speaking about structure, you mentioned that a couple of times. I would like to share with everyone something which I think is a quite brilliant aid to studying the Caitanya Charitamrita. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to share the screen, but what I want to show is a diagram that was prepared in a also very wonderful, very small book called Caitanya Charitamrita Compact, or Compact Caitanya Charitamrita, by Keshava Maharaj, that is Swayam Bhagavan Keshava Maharaj from England, very recently initiated into the sannyas ashram, previously Sutapa Prabhu. Let's see if I can do this. Share screen. And okay, here we are.
Wow.
He calls this the flow of nectar, which I think is quite appropriate. And he's, Keshava Maharaj is something of a poet himself. So he found 12 terms, each one in English, ending in the abstract Tion. So we have invocation, incarnation, education, transformation, organization, aspiration, propagation, renunciation, appreciation, correction, intoxication, and instruction as his terms for grouping, sometimes just well, in the case of Antya Lila 20, just one chapter, but in other cases, for example, invocation, he groups the first 12 chapters of Adi Lila, and then you can see how he groups the rest of them, and he gives a short explanation, divided into the three sections, Adi Lila, Madhya Lila, and Antya Lila. One somewhat curious feature here, one may notice in the Antya Lila section is part 9 and part 10. One he calls appreciation, and the second he calls correction, and both of them he's grouping Antya Lila chapters 1 through 13. And if we would look at these chapters, we could see why he's doing this, because indeed some chapters are emphasizing appreciation of devotees, and some chapters are emphasizing correction of one or another devotee. But in any case, I found this helpful for sort of orienting oneself. I think one of the challenges for devotees reading Caitanya Charitamrita, you look at the entire set of Caitanya Charitamrita, which now I think the BBT has published in, 5, 7, 9 volumes, originally 17 volumes, and we might want to speak a bit about that, Prabhupada's eagerness to publish the Caitanya Charitamrita. But we look at this and we may feel a bit overwhelmed. How can I enter into this nectar of Caitanya Charita Amrita, the nectar of the pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu? Well, here is one possibility to help. This could be used as a map, as a guide. And I might mention that this is available if one goes to Maharaj's website, Keshava Maharaj. Probably by now he has changed the name of his website to reflect his new name. And there he has this and also other works. He's done available for free download. So yeah, regarding structure, I think this can be helpful. So maybe we can talk a little about how important Caitanya Charitamrita is for us, followers of Srila Prabhupada, followers of Lord Chaitanya.
Well, today's the Parents' Day of Bhakti-Vinod Thakur.
Yes.
Maybe we should mention something about him. And
Yeah.
I find it very interesting, Bhakti-Vinod, some of his comments about Caitanya Charitamrita, where he read the Bhagavatam, but it didn't really strike him so much. He said he didn't really understand the Bhagavatam until after he came in touch with the Caitanya Charitamrita. And it was when he read the Caitanya Charitamrita, then he could appreciate the Bhagavatam.
And it was very difficult for him to get a copy of Caitanya. Right. He's in Bengal. It's a text which is in Bengali language. This is the latter half of the 19th century. And he can't find a copy of Caitanya Charitamrita. So we should consider ourselves extremely fortunate that we, who are, most of us, not in Bengal, who are not reading Bengali, have access to this work with English translation, word for word, translations, purports by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhakti-Vedanta Swami Prabhupada, in English and in some other languages, not so many others, I must say, but a few other non-Bengali languages. But I interrupted. Please go ahead.
And just as a note on what you were just saying, I find it interesting that Srila Prabhupada, in one purport, he cites Srila Bhakti-Vedanta, saying that if one really wants to appreciate Caitanya Charitamrita, they should learn Bengali. And it's something, it's when Srila Prabhupada gave it, of course, he gave the synonyms for each word, for each verse. There's so much depth in each and every word in Caitanya Charitamrita. Mm-hmm. It's just really, really, and if someone takes a little bit of time to understand the Bengali, there's so much more that's there. Because translations, as you know, Maharaj, you're multilingual. Translations can't really convey everything of the poetry, of the feeling, of the mood. There's so many things which may be there. Anyway, Caitanya Charitamrita has such an important position in our literature. I found it interesting in general with the writings of the six Goswamis to look at him through the perspective of the Bhagavatam. And you can see how, in one sense, all the literatures of our Goswamis, and especially Caitanya Charitamrita, and especially Jiva Goswami's Sandarbhas, are just expansions or explanations of the Bhagavatam. Mm-hmm. But if it wasn't for Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, especially with Caitanya Charitamrita, we wouldn't be able to perceive the special quality of the Bhagavatam. One sadhu scholar that I came in touch with some years ago made an interesting comment that he suggested that in the Bhagavatam, the most important chapter is the 47th chapter of the 10th canto, the Brahma Gita. And many Vaishnavas might find that a little surprising, because why not the first chapter, the first canto, or the Rasa Panchadhyaya, the 5 chapters about the Ras Leela? Why this 47th chapter? But because that 47th chapter is reflected in the Anchalila of Caitanya Charitamrita. Because of that 47th chapter, the 10th canto, which speaks about Srimati Radharani's ecstasies, we find the perfect explanation of that in the Caitanya Charitamrita. So the two books really, really go together. And although we can read about the life of Mahaprabhu in Murari Gupta's biography, or Vrindavan Das Thakur, or Lochan Das Thakur's Chaitanya Mangal, we don't really get the sense of the perspective of Mahaprabhu's life that we do through the Caitanya Charitamrita. And therefore, Kaviraj Goswami finishes each chapter by offering obeisances to Rupa Raghunath. And we see in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's a sense of Rupa Goswami, who's Sri Chaitanya Manobhishta, who's established the mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Kaviraj Goswami's really brought that out, that particular mood of Mahaprabhu, in the mood of Radharani, and in what particular mood of Radharani. It's a very, very amazing book in that way, which is not just the life of Mahaprabhu that we find in Chaitanya Bhagavat and others. And some Vaishnavas have said Chaitanya Bhagavat may be seen as more, Mahaprabhu's more Gaur-Narayan. Whereas in Chaitanya Charitamrita, we get the sense, as Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta said, that Sri Krishna Chaitanya Radha Krishna Nahi Anya, that he's a combined form of Radha Krishna. Predominantly in the mood, as Kaviraj Goswami says, is it Radha Bhava Dhyuti Suvalitam Nomi Krishna Sup, and he's Krishna, but in the mood of Radha.
Yeah. To the importance of Chaitanya Charitamrita for followers of Srila Prabhupada and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, in relation, you pointed out its importance for having access to Srimad Bhagavatam. I think it's helpful to consider, well, I like to see things in graphic form sometimes, but I don't have something to show. But we can easily imagine 3 concentric circles in which the outer circle, well, you can do this in different ways, but we start with the Bhagavad Gita and the readership of the Bhagavad Gita, which is to say, who has written commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, extends beyond the Vaishnava circle. It includes, of course, Sripad Shankaracharya has written his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, and so many sampradayas have their commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. So everyone is reading Bhagavad Gita. Then the scope narrows when we come to Srimad Bhagavatam. The Bhagavatam is studied by the Vaishnavas, not only the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, but other Vaishnava sampradayas as well. And we have commentaries from different Vaishnava sampradayas. And incidentally, according to one scholar I met, there was also a time that one Shaivite tradition was also reading Srimad Bhagavatam and being inspired by it. But generally it's a text for the Vaishnavas, but not just the Gaudiya Vaishnavas. Then we come to Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, and because the Chaitanya Charitamrita is telling the life of he who is none other than Radha Krishna Suvalitam Nomi Krishna Swarupam, as you said. This is the work that is defining Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It is therefore particularly dear to and essential to, we can say, the Gaudiya Vaishnavas. But it's also, I think, interesting that within the Chaitanya Charitamrita, how much Kaviraj Goswami praises Vrindavan Das Thakur as the Vyasa of Chaitanya Lila. So he seems to want to, obviously he wants to recognize Vrindavan Das as Chaitanya Bhagavata, and therefore include it as part of the account, in a sense, that he is giving. At the same time, his remains the last word. It is the last word because he is not, because he is bringing out the identity, the bhava the actual bhava of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But there's another thing I appreciate about Chaitanya Charitamrita, and that is the whole Chaitanya Charitamrita is an account of the perfect reader and reciter of the Bhagavatam, namely Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So in that way, it's giving us entry into what would it be like to perfectly and fully relish the Srimad Bhagavatam. It would be something like how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu relishes.
As Vrindavan Das Thakur says, Duistani Bhagavata, there's two Bhagavats. There's the Grantha Bhagavat and the Ara Krishna Kripa Patra, the devotee Bhagavat. And if it hadn't been for Vrindavan Das Thakur and especially Kaviraj Goswami and Chaitanya Charitamrita, we wouldn't know the mood of the Bhagavatam. We wouldn't know the mood. It's such a subtle thing. It's one of the fascinating things I find about Chaitanya Charitamrita is that we get an entrance into the mind of God, but the mind of God as a devotee.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to understand that he's the creator and the destroyer and the maintainer of everything, but to understand him in the mood of a devotee is a very, very astonishing thing. And Kaviraj Goswami, that's the most important subject that I see in Chaitanya Charitamrita, how to understand this mood of the Lord when he's come in as Bhakti Rup, in the mood of a devotee, in the mood of Srimati Radharani. Or as my Gurus would sometimes say, if you want to understand Srimati Radharani, you have to understand Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And conversely, he said, if you want to understand Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, you have to understand Srimati Radharani. He's in that mood. He's not coming as Bhagavan. And the first chapter of the Chaitanya Charitamrita sets the standard of things. It gives us Mangalacharana, the essence of the whole book. And then the second chapter speaks something about how Krishna was feeling unsatisfied, that he spoke the Bhagavad Gita, but he didn't give a personal example. And so then he realizes he has to come as a devotee, in the third chapter. And then in the fourth chapter, we hear about the mood of Srimati Radharani and how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Krishna in that mood. And then so many, another interesting thing I find in Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's full of discussions from devotees. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya teaching Mahaprabhu about Mukti Tattva, Ramananda Roy speaking to Mahaprabhu about Sadhya Sadhana Tattva, and Mahaprabhu was hearing from so many different devotees. And Bhakti-Vinod comments on that in his Harinam Chintamani, that this was a mood of Mahaprabhu. This is one of the contributions of Mahaprabhu. This is one of the contributions of Chaitanya Charitamrita, that we see God himself coming and hearing from his devotees and teaching us thereby that if we want to be a devotee, we have to take shelter of the devotees. We have to hear from the devotees.
Which reminds me of Mahaprabhu's conversation with Vallabhacharya in, I think it's Antya-lila chapter 7, where he lists several devotees that he, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, has learned from. So he's crediting one devotee after another with knowledge, with wisdom, with realization that he has then gained from them. And of course, he's doing this because he wants to teach Vallabha a lesson. And in this way, he's showing simultaneously how to teach, how to impart understanding, proper understanding in the proper mood to a senior devotee. You mentioned the word you mentioned Lord Chaitanya's dissatisfaction, or Krishna's dissatisfaction, and then appearing as Lord Chaitanya, and you alluded to his conversation with Ramananda Roy, which one could see as a series of expressions of dissatisfaction one after another of Ramananda Roy's statements of what is bhakti. He says, yes, that's all right, but keep going.
Eho bhaya, age kaha ar.
Eho bhaya, that's external. And he keeps pushing him. He keeps pushing until he starts to say, oh, now you're getting somewhere. Now keep going. So he's pushing the envelope, so to say. He's showing how bhakti is not to be contained. Bhakti is not to be contained in the frameworks in which it is normally conceived. I think I want to just jump back now in a way to how eager Srila Prabhupada was to present Chaitanya Charitamrita. We all know this. Many who will be watching this may be familiar with the story. Prabhupada's famous challenge to the...
Why don't you mention it again, Mars? Maybe some devotees aren't familiar with it. It's a very important history, I think.
Okay, the best person to tell this is Rameshwar. He was the one, really, who was there with Prabhupada. It was in Los Angeles, I believe, was it the year 1972, that Prabhupada was discussing, I think it was a morning walk, they were discussing about publishing Chaitanya Charitamrita. Prabhupada, I believe, was expressing some dissatisfaction with the speed at which the devotees were producing books. And he asked them, so how much time do you need to produce one book, one volume? And the answer he received was, well, it takes us about 2 months to actually completely produce a book. And I should mention that we may not appreciate, this was going on before computers. This was, digital. There was no such thing as digital layout. The machines they had were extremely primitive compared to what we have now for producing books. So they said, yeah, we can do one volume in 2 months. And then Prabhupada said, I want the entire Chaitanya Charitamrita done in 2 months. Now, at that time, they wouldn't have known how many volumes it was, but they would have known that it's going to be several volumes. It eventually, the completed work was produced in 17 volumes. But at that time, I believe it was Rameshwar Prabhu said, Prabhupada, that's not possible. And what was Prabhupada's famous reply? The word impossible is only to be found in a fool's dictionary. So he was implying, you want to be identified as a fool, okay, then we can say impossible. But I am not a fool, so I don't accept the notion of impossible. When it comes to serving Krishna, nothing is impossible. So the devotees took the challenge, and it became a 24/7 operation of a team of devotees, which included all varieties of skills, including artists doing production line painting of the paintings that would go in. And this was going on literally 24 hours a day. And so they were able, indeed, in 2 months to produce 17 volumes. Quite some feat. And then Prabhupada was satisfied. What Srila Prabhupada writes at the very end of Antya-lila, chapter 20, in which he expresses in which he expresses his joy at completing this work, and in particular how his spiritual master would be pleased, how much Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta Thakur would be pleased to see this work done, this translation and commentary.
I could read it. If that's helpful.
You found it.
It's a bit long, but we could break it apart.
Yes.
Prabhupada says, today, Sunday, November 10, 1974, corresponding to the 10th of Kartik, Chaitanya era 488, the 11th day of the dark fortnight of Rama Kadasi, we have now finished the English translation of Sri Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami, Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, in accordance with the authorized order of His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Goswami Maharaj, my eternal spiritual master, guide, and friend. Although according to material vision, His Divine Grace Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada passed away from this material world on the last day of December 1936, I still consider His Divine Grace to be always present with me by His Vani, His words. And Prabhupada goes on to explain about two ways of association by Vani and Vapu, and how he first met Srila Bhaktisiddhanta in 1922, and how Srila Bhaktisiddhanta ordered him to go to preach in the West, but how he was a householder until 1950 when he took Vanaprastha. He tells this whole story, which I think is important too, because he's tying his own personal story in with the story of Chaitanya Charitamrita. And there's some similarities also we could draw to Prabhupada's life and that of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. Kaviraj Goswami began the Chaitanya Charitamrita, as you were saying, at a very advanced age of 90-something. And Srila Prabhupada came to the West in his mid-70s in a similar way, not knowing how long am I going to live or anything. But Prabhupada, he later told the devotees that when he was coming over on the steamship, he was reading Chaitanya Charitamrita every day. And this Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's the essence of our movement. Although Srila Prabhupada hadn't, I find it significant, he hadn't finished the Bhagavatam, he stopped to work on Chaitanya Charitamrita, and he pushed the devotees to do this marathon, something completely crazy in one sense, to do 17 books in 2 months, because it's so important. This is the essential quality of our movement. This Chaitanya Charitamrita, it contains everything. A little later in that same last purport to Chaitanya Charitamrita, Prabhupada says, in the meantime, I was induced to translate Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita and publish it in an elaborate version. In his leisure time and later life, His Divine Grace, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would simply read Chaitanya Charitamrita. The work on this translation began about 18 months ago. Now, by the grace of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and His Divine Grace, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, it is finished. In this connection, I have to thank my American disciples, especially Sriman Pradyumna Das Adhikari, Sriman Nitai Das Adhikari, Sriman Jayadvaita Das Brahmachari, and many other boys and girls who are sincerely helping me in writing, editing, and publishing all these literatures. I think that His Divine Grace, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, is always seeing my activities and guiding me within my heart by His words. And Srila Prabhupada goes on in that same paragraph, he said, I don't think myself a very learned scholar, but I have full faith in the service of my spiritual master, His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. If there's any credit to my activities of translating, it is all due to His Divine Grace. Certainly, if His Divine Grace were physically present at this time, it would have been a great occasion for jubilation. But even though He's not physically present, I am confident that He's very much pleased by this work of translation. He was very fond of seeing many books published to spread the Krishna consciousness movement. Therefore, our society, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, has been formed to execute the order of Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu and his divine grace, Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And Prabhupada finishes with a short paragraph. It is my wish that devotees of Lord Chaitanya all over the world enjoy this translation. And I'm glad to express my gratitude to the learned men in the Western countries who are so pleased with my work that they're ordering in advance all my books that will be published in the future. On this occasion, therefore, I request my disciples who are determined to help me in this work to continue their cooperation fully, so that philosophers, scholars, religionists, and people in general all over the world will benefit by reading our transcendental literatures, such as Srimad Bhagavatam and Sri Chaitanya Caritamrita. Thus end the Bhakti-Vedanta purports to Sri Chaitanya Caritamrita, dated November 10, 1974, the Bhakti-Vedanta Book Trust, Hare Krishna Land, Juhu, Bombay. It's Prabhupada's last words.
Amazing. What was the date again that he gave?
November 10th, 1974.
74. Okay. So, yeah, maybe because Prabhupada ties the whole project of his translation very clearly into his personal mission, which is extending Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta Thakur's mission, which is moving forward into the future, and he's anticipating that we, he uses the word enjoy, I think. I expect devotees to enjoy reading this translation, right? So maybe we can say a little about our experience. I always like to remember when I was first exposed to a preview of Caitanya Caritamrita, which Srila Prabhupada had published prior to the first volume of Adi Lila in this book, which was paperback. It was called Sri Chaitanya in 5 Features. And it was his translation of Caitanya Caritamrita, Adi Lila, chapter 7. And possibly it included chapter 8, I'm not sure. But in which is described by Kaviraj Goswami about the Panchatattva and their mission, and about their plundering the storehouse of love of Godhead, and so on. And somehow we got a copy of that in Germany. In my memory, it was 1973 that we got this copy. Or maybe we got a few copies. And reading this, the brahmacharis got so excited with we were busting out of the room and busting out of the temple and running out on the street. We have to distribute this nectar of Krishna consciousness. We weren't distributing this book, Lord Chaitanya in 5 Features, but we understood Prabhupada's other books. We had Ishopanishads. I don't remember if we had German Bhagavad Gitas yet. In any case, the point is we got so excited that we immediately understood the point. The point was because Lord Chaitanya said, I request you, he says, I cannot harvest all these fruits myself. I need help. And therefore, I request everyone in the world to take up this Krishna consciousness and spread. So we understood we were being called. We felt ourselves, in a sense, like having the opportunity to be part of Caitanya Caritamrita. This was my first experience.
Probably my first experience. It's a little funny story. I was hitchhiking down as people used to do sometimes in the late 70s and early 80s, before so many terrible things happened in America. I was hitchhiking to San Francisco, and I met some person who was going to the Rath Yatra, and he started telling me very ecstatically how he wanted to go to India and he wanted to eat the dirt where Krishna walked, and he wanted to eat the dirt where Caitanya Mahaprabhu walked, and this and that. And that was one of the first times I heard about Caitanya Mahaprabhu. This person telling me how he wanted to go and eat the dirt where Mahaprabhu had appeared. And I had contact with devotees over the years, and I'd received Bhagavad Gita and a few different books. But it wasn't until later, when I was in Tucson, Arizona, that I was going to the center there, and somebody, somehow they were inspired, and they came to me and they said, here's this very special book. This is the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. And maybe we should mention something about that book also, Maharaj.
Yes.
Just as Srila Prabhupada gave Krishna book, which is a summary of the entire 10th canto, perhaps out of concern that he wouldn't be able to present that before he left this world, Prabhupada gave us Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, which is more or less a summary of the entire Chaitanya Caritamrita. And that was published in 14th of March, 1968 in New York. So that book, to this day, I consider one of the most philosophically abstruse, difficult books that Prabhupada gave us, the highest books. But when this devotee gave me a copy of that in Tucson, Arizona, that book made me into a devotee. And it was a very simple thing. I remember just starting reading the book, and I read about the concept of devotional service, which is Prabhupada stressing that, which was what Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came to give. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that's it. That's the topmost thing, to be able to serve God. And so I got that. That made me a devotee, basically, was Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. And then a little later, I ended up in the Los Angeles temple, and I was Bhakta Mark. And someone came to me after a few days and said, hey, new Bhakta, come and help us. We're cleaning out this go-down. And we were cleaning out the storage room, and I found a copy of Chaitanya Caritamrita, Adi Lila Volume 1. And they said, oh, can I have this? And they said, sure, new Bhakta, you can have that book. And I started reading that book, and I was very attracted by Adi Lila Chapter 4. I started memorizing some verses and things in it. And generally, that's subject matter which devotees would consider to be something which you would read much, much later.
You joined the Gopi Bhava Club. Is that what you're trying to say?
It just struck me so powerfully. And of course, what could I understand of that? And later I read Prabhupada Lilamrita, which really gave me some basis for Prabhupada's movement, and also gave us some understanding of how important Chaitanya Caritamrita and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was for Srila Prabhupada. But I appreciate Chaitanya Caritamrita so much that that's the book which really made me into a devotee. It's the first thing I read, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, and then in Adi Lila Chapter 4, I was reading that. I couldn't really understand it, but it was so very, very attractive. The conception of this very esoteric thing, how God has come as his own devotee, or to read about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the Gambhira, how when the Supreme Personality of Godhead locks himself up in a room and cries for himself. I've never come across something so
What kind
esoteric.
of religion is this?
It's an amazing thing. Chaitanya Caritamrita obviously was so important for Srila Prabhupada in so many ways, because although our movement is all about the Bhagavatam, we can't understand the Bhagavatam without Chaitanya Caritamrita. Really, our movement's about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Prabhupada wanted so much to give this to the devotees. Who was it? What's the name of the professor, Maharaj, in the early days in New York? He's one of the first secular scholars who met the Tompkins?
Tom Hopkins.
Tom Hopkins, right. Wasn't it him that he met some devotee that came to his house or something, and he saw their Gaudiya Tilak and their Kunti Mala, and he's a professor understanding about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but he was astonished that the devotees didn't know about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Well,
Wasn't it Hopkins?
I don't know that specific story, but Tom came, the late Tom Hopkins, he died recently, visited the 26th Second Avenue temple at one time in the very early days. And he came in, I think he had a couple of students with him. Tom Hopkins had done his doctoral dissertation on Srimad Bhagavatam. And at that time, there were a total of 2 editions of of Bhagavatam available in the entire United States, and they were both in university libraries. So he came in and he saw there was the 3 volumes of First Canto Bhagavatam, and he was amazed. And it was a translation, and there was a young bhakta or devotee in the temple room at that time, and he started chatting. Tom started chatting with him, and he said, "So Swamiji, he's from Bengal, yes?" And this devotee said, "No, he's from India." And from that, Tom Hopkins could understand these young fellows, they mean well. They don't know very much.
I remember reading somewhere where Hopkins, maybe it was an interview I saw with him, where he was mentioning that he asked something about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the devotees, and he was surprised the devotees didn't know who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was. This is such an early time. And it's significant. He was very struck, as you mentioned, about the Bhagavatam. And what did Srila Prabhupada give in his introduction to the Bhagavatam? He gave, again, a synopsis of the life of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the introduction, because that's the essence of the Bhagavatam. That's how we have to introduce the Bhagavatam. And that's what we want to arrive at, as you were mentioning earlier. That's our conclusion, the Chaitanya Charitamrita.
Yes. A couple of things come to my mind to mention, and I guess gradually we're supposed to come to an end. But for readers, again, present-day readers who may feel challenged by the extent and the extent of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, how to appreciate it, of course, just read, just keep reading, and gradually, and keep reading again and again. Not that you've finished, you start over again. You mentioned teachings of Lord Chaitanya. This can be also very helpful, in which I think Prabhupada's main focus is on Lord Chaitanya's teachings to Rupa Goswami and Srila Sanatana Goswami, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, it strikes me that Srila Prabhupada really especially relished the story of Sanatana Goswami's escape from prison and then his departure for Vrindavan, meeting Lord Chaitanya, that encounter with Lord. Something about that. There are recordings of a devotee reading aloud and Prabhupada commenting on that episode. So it struck me also that Prabhupada very much identified with that particular episode. Another general observation I found that anyone can appreciate about Chaitanya Charitamrita is how much discussion in Chaitanya Charitamrita, how many pastimes there are having to do with eating, with food, with prasadam. There's this completely joyful feature of Chaitanya Charitamrita, the spirit one can enter into of devotees coming together, feasting, and relishing Krishna prasadam. And of course, there's so much rich philosophy, theology that's also elaborated. But I always like to think that one reason that Krishnadas Kaviraj wrote about this so extensively, about food, is that sometimes listing, particular Bengali preparations that were made prepared for Lord Chaitanya. I suspect that this is because Krishnadas Kaviraj was living in Vrindavan most of his life, from as a young man when Nityananda Prabhu sent him there from his appearance in a dream to for the rest of his life. So I think he was missing out. He was missing some of the cooking, some of the subjects available not in Vrindavan, but in Bengal. In any case, he seems to also want to invite his readers to relish Krishna Bhakti literally through Krishna Prasada.
That's an interesting analysis, Maharaj. It strikes me that the Bhagavatam is largely philosophical, or we could describe it as a philosophical book, but we don't know how to live the life of a devotee.
Yeah.
And Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami has given us that, and especially the prasadam, and as you mentioned, in so many recipes even and descriptions, he's preserving the culture of that. And he also describes the water pastimes, how the devotees were behaving in Narendra Sarovar and different places, and how the devotees should interact, how they should behave. And in that sense, the Chaitanya Charitamrita is so very, very important. We have theology in the Bhagavatam. We don't know how to walk. We don't know how to do that, how to live that without the Chaitanya Charitamrita. I'd like to share real quick on the screen Prabhupada's dedication to Chaitanya Charitamrita. He says, presented to my friends and devotees who like to read my books and who approach me to request that I render the great Chaitanya Charitamrita in English. So, such an important book for Srila Prabhupada, for his disciples. Again, let's see, there's another very powerful statement I find you must be familiar with, Maharaj. This is at the end of Madhya Lila of Chaitanya Charitamrita. There we go. And Kaviraj Goswami says very beautifully, Jai Lila Amrita Bine Kaya Jadi Anapani, that if you don't Jai Lila Amrita Bine, without this Lila Amrita, without this nectar of these pastimes, someone may be Kaya Jadi Anapani, they may be eating different grains and things, but if they don't take this pastimes of Chaitanya Charitamrita, Mahaprabhu, then they'll fall down. As Prabhupada translates, if one drinks but a drop of the nectar of Krishna's pastimes, his body and mind begin to bloom and he begins to laugh, sing, and dance. So these two go together, the pastimes of Krishna and the pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Prabhupada gives a very simple purport here, which always struck me. All the devotees connected with the Krishna conscious movement must read all the books that have been translated, the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, and others. Otherwise, after some time, they will simply eat, sleep, and fall down from their position. Thus, they'll miss the opportunity to attain an eternal, blissful life of transcendental pleasure. Right. So I was thinking about your comments and how when the devotees in Germany first got those early sections of the Chaitanya Charitamrita and how it struck you, this is our life, to go out and share this with people. Prabhupada, this Chaitanya Charitamrita is something that we have to live. Otherwise, we can't really understand the Bhagavatam.
Yes. I think what you just showed us on the screen, this verse and purport, is an appropriate last word for our discussion today, to which I would have nothing to add that would not detract from that statement. So perhaps we should end remembering this really command from Srila Prabhupada that we should read all of the books which he has translated, including Chaitanya Charitamrita. And if someone is not an English reader, or I believe it's translated in French, Spanish, Portuguese, probably Russian, Bengali, of course, and Hindi.
Oriya.
Oriya, okay. then what to do? What you should do is either, well, you can start learning Bengali, be learning English, and you can be urging those who are organizing your yatra in your language to put little pressure and say, we need these books in our language.
I thank you very much for this discussion, Maharaj. I think this discussion itself is something devotees should do. And I want to thank Krishna Prem Rupa Prabhu and yourself and others for organizing this, because Chaitanya Charitamrita is the life. It's a life force of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and that life force is kept alive also by discussing it. So even as you were saying, if some devotees don't have access to Bengali or English, they only know Eskimo language or some particular language that there's no Chaitanya Charitamrita available in, still then devotees should come together and make discussions available like this. And I feel like by getting your association today and discussing something of this, I'm getting to live a little bit of the Chaitanya Charitamrita.
The same is the case for me. And I'm also very grateful for this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to our meeting in person again in coming months.
I'm very much looking forward, Maharaj. Thank you again.
Chaitanya Charitamrita ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Gaur Premanande Hari Bol. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare.